Hello, everyone, and welcome to the real part one of the IoT ML Lab. So now we're actually going to finally dive into the main content. So we got through the introduction, we know what we're talking about, and I've already fired up the glitch page here for the lab, and the links again are going to be in the description of this video if you didn't take them down from the introduction. So we're gonna go to part one here, and all of these parts will always be here. They're not gonna be taken down or anything like that. They might change if there's any fixes or anything like that that has to happen, but you should always be able to access them from here. So we're gonna dive into part one, which is gonna be pretty basic. It's gonna be our introduction to Vue. So when we first go to the project page here, we've got a couple of options. So I think by default, it's just going to run the app here in this window, and then there will be a dynamic render of the README. So you can either expand that and read through the details here, or you can go ahead and edit project, which is what we're going to do, just because I prefer that environment a little bit better. Um, So if we dive in here, by default, it should take us to the README markdown file. So if you're jumping into any of these modules, definitely start here. There's going to be a very similar structure in the README here, but it's essentially trying to highlight what are the most important things that we're going to work with in this module, and what are the biggest changes from the last module. Since this is the first module, there really aren't so many changes because this is the first time we're using this, and we're pretty much starting from a template. But in the modules going forward, we will have a lot more in that respect, and there will be some code snippets as well. So for this one, like I said, we're just going to scaffold our Vue application. We're going to get up and running and make sure that we can work with the basics of Vue, pass data back and forth, stuff like that. So this is pretty much almost entirely a generic template. Um, so if you're wondering where a lot of these files are coming from, they're just generic boilerplate that should come when you start a Vue project on Glitch or somewhere else. It should look very, very similar. Um, so for the most part, we will be working with the files that are in source. The files that are in public, you can see some of these are named kind of weird too. So these are going to be auto-built every time that we make a change. So don't worry about these right here. Index.html is going to be a generic placeholder. So since we're using Vue.js, which is a reactive framework, we're not really going to hard code anything into the HTML. We're basically just going to point it to the output of build.js, which is again another dynamically built script. So don't go in there and try to change that or try and read it or anything like that. This isn't going to make too much sense. This is going to be the output of our build when we make changes, and I'll talk a little bit about how that works now. So because Vue is a framework, we still need to ultimately transpile it down to something that browsers can run and read. So whatever we do in our .vue files is fine and great, but we still need to compile it to JS, HTML, and CSS that any old browser can read. Um, so we're doing that here in package.json. So we're using some utilities that just make a little bit more sense for Glitch and the front end that we're using. We're using Browserify, which is basically just going to build our output and compile it to the static build.js file. If you were to create a Vue project on your machine using the Vue CLI, um, you're probably not going to use this and this. I believe they just compile it with Webpack and Babel. Um, but nevertheless, the reason why I wanted to do it this way is that so we can still work with app.vue files, and we're going to get a build process that looks, as close to a traditional Vue project as possible. Because of that, though, there are going to be a couple of funny things that we just have to deal with Vue. So again, if you're running this project locally on your machine and it was started from this Vue CLI, every time you make a change to something, whether it's a string or whether it's a style or anything like that, the template should dynamically re-render and recompute. Because we're kind of going through this build middleware in Glitch. We're actually going to have to manually force that rebuild, which is just a little bit annoying, but it's not a big deal. So we can do it a number of different ways. Basically, Glitch wants to sense a change in one of our core files, but the problem is that it doesn't recognize the .vue files as core files because they're part of a framework, which is kind of layers itself on top of Glitch's normal runtime logic. So there's a couple things we can do. I typically just like to go into one of these files and make a kind of simple change like that. And you'll see once this pops up and this starts churning, it means that the build is happening. And pretty much package.json server and I think main.js. Just doing a simple little back and forth change will trigger the build. So you'll see me do it throughout the lab. That's why I'm doing it. It's just a little bit of funkiness. Um, and I guess I should also mention about this server.js file here. So because we're compiling to a static HTML and JS, we still need to serve that somehow. So here we've just used Express at its most basic implementation just to host the static app. It's basically just hosting this HTML and JS file so that when you go to view this app, like if I was to, just go to its actual URL, so that this thing that's being rendered here is actually being able to be served and expresses the thing that's serving it. So we really don't need to worry about that. That's just here again, so we can serve it. It's not going to change. We're just going to keep it here. Same thing with package.json. It's going to be obviously defining our dependencies and some of our scripts, but we're not really going to worry about changing it. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this public folder. I'm going to leave package.json and server.js in the, just as they are. And I'm going to start diving into the actual Vue stuff. So, like I said, a lot of this is templates. So this Babel ERC file that we're going to find still preset template from just your standard Vue thing. Don't need to worry about it too much. Same thing with main.js. Can't speak. Same thing with main.js. It's just the entry point of our Vue app. And here we're pointing Vue to the resources that it needs, obviously to the Vue package. And we're saying that our main entry point for Vue files is app.vue. And so what this is going to do is that it's going to basically look for this ID tag in our public HTML, and that is where it's going to inject our entire Vue app. So if you look at index.jml, .html, there is a div here with the ID of app, and that's exactly what main.js is going to look for. So again, we don't need to worry about anything in this public folder. Going to minimize it. This is our entry point. This is also really not going to change for this lab unless we decide to use some plugins or stuff like that for Vue. But all in all, it's going to be the same. So long story short, everything in this folder is pretty much generic template. And really the only thing we're going to start worrying about right now is this app.vue file. So let's dig into that. In the introduction slideshow, which will be linked at the bottom of this video as well, we talked a little bit about Vue, and there were some links to the documentation to the main page of Vue.js. So I highly encourage everybody to do just a little pass at the documentation before this, or maybe even in parallel to this workshop. But it's going to teach you a lot of those specifics and fundamentals that we're going to go over now in a lot more detail than I'm going to go over now. So right now I'm just going to go over it just enough so that you know what we're doing and what we're working with, but the details are really, really best found in the source documentation. So this is what a traditional Vue style Vue file looks like though. We've got our three main sections. We've got a template section, we have a script section, and we have a style section. So our template section is essentially holding HTML with dynamically bound properties that we'll talk about in a second. Our script section is defining the Vue component, things like states, things like functions, components, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. And the style tag basically just holds all your style. So whether it's CSS, Sass, or something else, this is where we put it. And the idea is that this single file component starts to be its own entity. It pretty much has all the pieces of the puzzle in order to be a piece of functionality, right? I mean, it's got the business logic, it's got the UI, and it's got the styling on the UI, if you want to think about it that way. So that's a Vue file. And it's going to be convenient for us in this application just because we'll be able to keep everything in one place. And honestly, our code isn't really going to get too big anyway. So this is all kind of going to be coming from the same source, and it will be useful that way. So for this one, we're just going to dive into some very, very basic Vue specifics, namely props. So props are important. Props are the way that we have of passing data between Vue components. So I'm going to comment this out right now just for the time being, or actually it looks like I deleted it, but there we go. All right, so now you'll notice that this won't this won't show what I just did because remember, it's not sensing the app file as a main change. So I'm just going to go here and just force it to rebuild really quick. And in a second here, see it's waking up and now it's back to normal. And we can see that nothing is here. So empty right now. I'm going to go back to the Vue app. So obviously, if this was, your traditional hello world example and you did something, you'd probably want to display a static message. So in this case, I don't know, message. I'm going to force that rebuild again. It's kind of going to be not so fun in the initial modules just because we're going to do light changes frequently. But all right, so you can see that this is static and hard coded. That's great. But that's typically not what most websites and web apps are these days, right? We want dynamic stuff. We want interactivity. We want data to move back and forth. So we're probably never going to have this instance where we hard code something because that would explode the amount of code we have to write, and we have to account for a million scenarios rather than just dynamically passing things that we care about. So how does Vue help us solve that? Well, through props and data. And data in the Vue context is going to be very familiar to you if you know anything about React hooks or have worked with React hooks in the past. This is basically a local state on our component. And the way that it's defined in Vue is like this. You create a data object on this Vue class, and the data object has to return a function. That's just the Vue paradigm. They can explain it a little bit, better as to why that is and why that's useful. But for our purposes, we just need to know that the data object has to return a function. And then after that, all of these can be really whatever you want. I can create a new variable and it can be a number, maybe two, I don't know. It can be a string, it can be an array, all kinds of things. And these are not just things that are going to be hard typed. These are also things that we can access later on with methods and functions and all that stuff. We can reference these throughout our Vue component. So this is going to be really, really useful. So you can see for this module that I've just created a very simple message thing. So it just says hello from Vue app. And if you remember our preview, you probably can expect where it's going to show up. So right here, I've turned on my H1 tag again, but you can see rather than hard coding my hello from Vue app, I've done this thing. So this double curly brace syntax is one way that Vue has of injecting dynamic content to the DOM. So basically what this is going to tell Vue is that we're not passing in a string literal. We're passing a reference to an object that's going to exist somewhere in this component. And in our case, that happens to exist in this data object. That's, here we go, message. That's what we're going to pull. So if I again rebuild this very quickly, I think this should trigger the build. It will. If I rebuild this, we can now see that this is going to refresh and it's going to pull that message. So this is essentially how basic reactivity works. And it's fine and great in one component, but as we make our app bigger and we start to create more complex logic, these things are going to need to become layered. And again, if you're familiar with other component-based architectures like React or Angular or something like that, you probably already know that your app isn't going to be one component or two or five or even 10. It's probably going to be a lot more than that, depending on your architecture. So this is the basics of how we start pulling data from the Vue component, but there's a lot more things that we're going to get into. Once we start creating new components and we start defining them here, as you can kind of imagine by this little placeholder, we're going to use components throughout the HTML template as well, and we're going to need to pass data to those components. So that is going to be what our next module is really going to get into. But for now, these are just the Vue basics. You can play around with this, again, remix this if you'd like, and see what data can do for you and see the amount of functionality that you can get out just from this simple interaction. So that's it for this module, and let's get into the second one.